Good afternoon and welcome, Professor Anne Hege Grung. I'm glad to have you for this interview for the online Feminism and Religion FER school organized in the Balkans region in local languages, Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian. We have Feminist Theology course for this school, and one of the topics is about interreligious feminist theology. Since you are an expert in the field with all of your books and writings and teachings and activism, we wanted to have you and talk a little bit more about this topic. For the beginning, I would like to ask you, how do you define feminist theology? Because there are so many definitions, and I would like to hear from you what feminist theology is for you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this. And I also want to say congratulations with what is an amazing course, both innovative and very important. So thank you for being invited here. To define feminist theology is really important, and it's also difficult because just as feminist studies or gender studies have started to be very determined to use plural about feminism, that you don't talk about feminist, you talk about feminisms. And I think the same goes for feminist theology. So we have to talk about feminist theologies, and what they share, all of them share, is a normative element. Theology is a normative scholarship, and feminism and feminisms are normative movements or normative approaches to reality. And the core of feminisms is to both detect, reveal, and change gender injustice, to put it very shortly. So to me, feminist theologies are about justice, are about scholarly work and practical theological work to change the gender injustice that theologies and religions are doing to women. You could also include men here, because feminism is not only work for women, but it has this particular element of recognizing that the gender injustices we see also in present theologies and religious practices more often than not are deprivileging women. So men and the male is seen as an authority, and women are subordinated under men. And this is to the disadvantage of both women and men, because it means the community is hurt. It's hurt because it's practices of injustice. And where there's injustice, the community is hurt. So I would also like to add that feminist theologies are often seen as a specific form of theology concentrated on in certain contexts, and there are elements within the scholarly discourse that are, for instance, including womanist theology that has a slightly different analysis, but in the broad sharing the same aim. But you could find more context-specific currents of feminist theologies that are addressing particular injustices in particular contexts.
Thank you. It's important to contextualize the reading, and then to what extent lived religion and the experience of women and marginalized groups is relevant to feminist theology.
Yeah, I think it's very important to call upon intersectional feminism, which means that gender is not the only analytical category where you analyze injustices and look for ways to improve justice. Gender is only one part of our lives, and we have other categories like race, social class, ethnic belonging, age, and disabilities. You know, we have a range of human differences that sometimes interplay when you analyze power structures. So you can see that it's different to be, for instance, a Christian woman in Norway and be a Muslim woman. So we have to take that into consideration and call on intersectional feminism.
Okay, thank you. And it is related to the next question I want to ask. It's about interreligious theology, which is pretty much new phenomenon. And having that in mind, the feminist interreligious theology is even newer. So can you elaborate a bit more? What would be feminist interreligious theology? Does it exist, and how it looks like?
Well, that is a very, very good question. I would say yes, it exists, but it's still in the making. I think that interreligious theology is obviously a theology that has elements from more than one religion, but it could be composed in many different ways. But a feminist interreligious theology would clearly have more than one religious tradition as sources for constructing gender justice, for instance. So I would say that a feminist interreligious theology would have the task of revealing gender injustices in more than one tradition, but also in the dynamics between the religions when they meet or when they are together. So it's a more complex way of doing theology, but very rewarding and very much needed, I think. So you would include normative aspect of gender justice at all levels.
Thank you. And you, in your book, Gender Justice in Christian Muslim Readings, offer a model of interreligious reading of sacred text from the Bible and the Quran. Does this methodological approach promote a better understanding between members of these two religious traditions? And does this approach empower women who are marginalized in the process of interpretation of sacred texts in their religious communities and churches?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and of course a very big question. But I think in my book and in the work I did writing my book, when I established a group of Muslim and Christian readers in Norway, discussing texts from the Bible, the Hadith, and the Quran, certain things happened when the texts were read together and then discussed and interpreted together. And I think what was empowering for everyone was that the working with the text revealed shared challenges. So the Christian women could see that the Muslim women had challenges and see how they worked to meet those challenges. And the other way around, the Muslim women could see how the Christian women met their challenges, but the challenges were not the same. And also the interpretation strategies were not the same. And I think that's very significant because feminist interreligious theology is not about conflating the differences or making everything the same. It's very important that the various traditions can identify the challenges they have and not import challenges from a different religion. But at the same time, what they all did was that they could encourage each other to be brave enough to interpret the texts, and that what they reflected over and discussed about the texts was important and valid points. So they listened to each other and they also spoke. And that meant that the knowledge was shared across religious boundaries, and also it made it possible to move beyond the stereotypes that we find about both Muslim and Christian women. Because it seems that women are particularly exposed to religion-based stereotypes, that how women dress, how we behave, how we live our lives as believers, seem to be more of an identity marker in religious communities than what men do. And this makes it vulnerable in order to, you have to deconstruct the stereotypes. So when the the Christian women in the group could experience that the Muslim women were, just as that it was possible for them to speak freely about their texts. It changed the image the Christian women had, that Muslim women were more suppressed, not able to speak up their mind. And the other way around, of course, the Muslim women also experienced that Christian women were sincere in their beliefs, because it seemed like this was the most common stereotypes that these groups had about the other group, that the Muslim women had to prove that they were true feminists, and the Christian women had to prove that they were true believers. I think this was very interesting.
It's a very interesting dynamic. And in general, many women in Christianity and in Islam do not dare to approach the sacred text, thinking that they are not knowledgeable enough, equipped enough with proper methodology for interpretation. As a scholar, theologian with the significant experience in this field, what do you recommend? Should all women and men read their sacred texts, notwithstanding of their deeper knowledge and skills in hermeneutics and exegesis? or this should be reserved only for scholars and those who are trained for this?
This is a question that has been discussed a lot. You know, who has the right to interpret? Who has the right to read, and who has the interpretative authority over the texts? I do think, of course, that that well-educated scholars have a lot to contribute around our sacred scriptures. But on the other hand, the ordinary reader, of course, nobody's ordinary, but the non-specialists, they have different experience and different knowledge that is just as important in the community, because these texts are not the property of a certain group. It's not even the property of a certain religious group. I think it's a way of a shared treasure that we all can have access to. And I think most of us know that these scriptures can be used in very, very destructive ways. And they could be life-threatening in their use. And I believe that that the non-scholars are even closer to this feeling very often, and that their personal relationship with the scripture can be very, very valuable to share. So I say yes to scholars, and we should contribute what we have, but the interpretative authority cannot be limited to scholars or limited to religious leaders as such. This is very, very important.
Thank you. When we think about our current time, what believers, both men and women, can get from the reading of their sacred text? How that can help them to be better believers, better human beings, and to better serve their communities?
Yes, I think, actually, I think that in our times, when religious belongings are used so in a divisive way, many places, and I think that it should be much more common to read the text across religious boundaries. I think it would be, you know, to normalize the activity of reading text together, I think is a very important way to find hope in the scriptures, because if you are more than one tradition, you get also different you can have different perspectives from the texts. So you would learn to know how your sacred text works on the other from a different tradition. And as long as these texts are used to divide us or to promote gender injustice, we need to correct that. And the only way we can do that is to read it together and take a moral responsibility for how the texts are interpreted. I love this concept by Abu al-Fadl, to have a moral enrichment process of the texts, and also Elisabeth Schiffer-Wenzel's ethical criticism of the text. So we have to take responsibility for the text, and because we believe that our religious traditions are there to establish hope, community, and justice, we need to use that as a hermeneutical key for what we find important in the texts.
Thank you. Having in mind that through centuries, men had authority to interpret the text It was predominantly masculine theology, and even today it is. So when women get engaged as interpreters of the sacred texts and spiritual leaders, what we can get out of it, what is valuable from that, what they can bring to the table, to the world, to the community, what is missing from these predominantly masculine readings of the sacred texts?
This is a very, very interesting question. I think that women, of course, have different skills, different experiences, and are a diverse group. But I think that around half of the population of the world are women. So half of the population of the world are women. So one way to see it is, how can we possibly afford to let out half of the population when it comes to experiences and knowledge about the texts and how they work? And then, of course, because we are assigned to different gender roles, we experience the world differently. And I think these experiences has to come forward, and they need to be listened to. We know that in armed conflicts and wars, women are victims in a different way than men. Everyone are victims, but women are hit in a different way. And if we believe that religions and religious communities can bring healing, then they need to listen to these specific experiences, and that nobody could replace women's narratives and knowledge in this way.
Yeah, and if we know that intellectual capacities are endowed equally to both women and men, so we are wasting that intellectual capacity, not if we don't include women in these processes and don't have fresh and different interpretations from different angles, different experiences.
Exactly. So it's extremely important that we use all resources we have, and I think that it may be that that this process of gender justice may take some time, but I think it's very, very important to continue the process and to have the whole community, as the subject for transformation. In the group of readers that I studied, the women were very concerned that changing the communities into being more gender just communities could not only be the work of women, it had to be cooperation between everyone. I think that's also an important point. It's not only the responsibility of women, but the responsibility of everyone.
Of course, but women are more interested in, because they are excluded and they are not, they don't have the same chances as men. But of course, for the genuine transformation, we need both. And in the end, I would like to ask you something about female spiritual leadership, women priests, imams. Today we have so many discussions about it, especially in Islam and Catholicism, and then in religious traditions that do not allow women to be ordained or to be to serve as imams, although we have some female spiritual leaders, for instance, in Islam, in Sufism for centuries, etc., but still as imams in mosques, it's a new development. what do you think? Should women stay out of it and leave that space for men to continue to be spiritual leaders, or should they fight for that and share also the responsibility, but also the power in their religious communities and churches?
I think that it's important to work for the sharing of power and sharing of responsibility, and I think there could be several ways to reach this, but I think it's a matter of not only of justice but also about using the resources and healing the communities. Because I myself, I'm an ordained minister in the Church of Norway, but when I was ordained, a lot of people in that particular congregation stayed away because they were against women priests. I of course felt that, and it was a challenge, and it may surprise some of you that this happened in Norway in 1992, but now this would not have happened in the Church of Norway. And I think it's important to remember that we have all been through this. Things has been improving in many ways, so it's very important not to go back or to stay out. I think if we did that, if we stopped fighting for this, our religious communities will become less relevant, particularly for women, and that would mean a more closed religious practice, and we cannot afford that, I think.
Yeah, we should not, and hopefully we will not. So in the end of this interview, is there anything you would like to say or to recommend, to suggest to women in the Balkans? What would be your final thought, suggestion, message, whatever?
Well, thank you. I would say stay together. Stay together, and don't let the structures divide you, but stay together and have faith in your own narratives. You have very powerful narratives. I know that because I've been so lucky to be visit the Balkans. Stay with your narratives and stay together.
Thank you, Professor Anne Hege, for this interview, and we hope to have an opportunity to host you in the Balkans again and to collaborate with you.
Thank you so much.